Let's be blunt. What has unfolded at the BBC over the last week looks uncannily like an internal power play that's escaped its confinement field, and the corporation's attempt to wrap it in language of sober public service is, frankly, self-delusional. Starting with the sequence, a memo from Michael Prescott, a former advisor on editorial standards, is leaked. It doesn't just complain about one panorama film, it alleges a pattern of coverage on Trump, on Gaza, on trans questions that tilt it in the same direction. That memo is then energetically taken up inside the board by Robbie Gibb and like-minded members, according to multiple reports, which is why the BBC insiders are using the word coup for what happened to Deborah Turness and by extension to Tim Davie. The board didn't storm the building, but it did use a single provable mistake to force a much wider reckoning about the editorial centre of gravity. That is political, whether the actors admit it or not. Now, bringing in Trump, his letter from Florida is theatrically priced at $1 billion. That figure is not really about damages, it's about rerunning his favourite argument that big media fabricate material to hurt him and that he can make them crawl. He has form persuading large media organisations to settle rather than endure discovery, so his ally, Chris Ruddy, is not fantasising when he says Trump may think he can win or at least force movement. But media lawyers would be right to say that in Florida, the bar for a public figure to prove serious loss from one edited sequence is very high. If the BBC fights, Trump invites a courtroom replay of every incendiary thing he said on and around the 6th of January, which is not good politics for him. So legally it's shaky, but rhetorically it is good. Here is the problem for the BBC. Once Samir Shah has admitted that splicing those parts of the 6th of January speech gave the impression of a direct call for violent action, the corporation cannot in the same breath present itself as the imperturbable guardian of truth. That admission concedes the very point Trump is using as a battering ram. Yet the BBC's wider line has been to say in effect that yes, there was an error of judgment, but no, there is not institutional bias. That halfway house satisfies no one. It angers staff who see the Panorama team being scapegoated for much bigger politics of the board. It fuels those in government and on the right who have wanted to prove systemic bias for years, and it leaves viewers wondering why two of the most senior figures have resigned if this was truly just a 12-second mis-edit. The narrative doesn't cohere. Why then are people calling it a coup? Because of timing and silence. When the Telegraph began running the Prescott material, newsroom leaders wanted to apologise quickly for the Trump edit so they could defend the rest of their journalism. The chair held back, waiting for a collective board response. Into that vacuum walked Trump with $1 billion threat, Nigel Farage with a tidy argument for a subscription model, and Conservative and Lib Dem voices demanding the removal of Robbie Gibb, or at least a clean-up of political appointments. By Sunday night, the Director General and the Head of News had gone, and the board members who had pushed hardest were still in their seats. That looks, inside new broadcasting house, like the editors lost and the politicians won. Now, add the external pressure. Trump's suit, even if weak, gives GB News, The Spectator, parts of the Mail and Telegraph ecosystem a single emblematic failure to hang years of complaints on. They can say, look, this is what we said about Gaza coverage, about trans coverage, about selection of guests, about push notifications that somehow miss migration stories. The BBC's classic defence has always been that everyone is angry, so we must be about right. That doesn't work when you've just taken off two of your own engines in mid-flight. There is also a constitutional dimension. The BBC is entering chartered territory for 2028. A Director General who steps down saying he must take ultimate responsibility gives ministers and Ofcom the perfect pretext to say the government model, the governance model, the model that's existed so far is not working, that the editor-in-chief role is too big, that board appointments must change, and that the licence fee must be tied to stricter impartiality metrics. Lisa Nandy and Keir Starmer can say publicly that the BBC is not corrupt and must be protected, while privately welcoming leverage to change board appointment rules and strip out most of the overtly partisan voices. That is what makes the corporation vulnerable right now. It is bleeding authority at precisely the moment politicians want to redesign it. Where is the self-delusion in the way the BBC keeps insisting this can be handled by ordinary process? Ordinary process would have been a prompt correction in October 2024, a quiet ticking off of panorama and no more. Ordinary process is impossible once a leak, a board faction and a litigious US president have fused. To tell staff today that this is simply about living up to the Reithian values is to ignore the fact that one board member with strong Tory connections appears to have had far more oxygen in the room than any editor. That is not editorial independence. That is an institution pretending nothing foundational, nothing fundamental has changed while everyone else can see that it has. So, I think there are 5 points to summarise. First, we should admit the edit was wrong and that the apology came too late. That's already on the record. Stress the lateness is what turned the mistake into a crisis. We should say plainly that Trump is using this to validate his long-running story about hostile media, pointing out that his legal path is narrow in Florida and that discovery could hurt him, which is why the BBC should not be panicked into writing a cheque. We should name the internal issue without theatricality. This was a board-led escalation in which editorial leadership was outmanoeuvred. That is why people inside are calling it a coup. That word did not come from nowhere, but it doesn't mean that the BBC is clean and the BBC is acting correctly. The BBC has a fairly long history of dodgy decisions recently. We should warn that if the board is permitted to act as an ideological filter for news output, the argument for a compulsory licence fee collapses. You cannot compel payment for journalism that is visibly being steered by political appointees. That is Farage's opening, and he knows it. It's fairly easy to fix, actually. And we should we should emphasise. We should talk about the institutional stakes, and maybe that's worth another video. The BBC survives not because it never errs, but because it corrects fast and is seen to defend reporters, not sacrifice them. This time it was too slow. It failed to protect its own. It's allowed opponents to set the tempo. That is the real failure. It's the failure of Tim Davie. He's been a plonker from the very beginning. This is not about, really, a clumsy edit of a Trump speech. This is about the inadequacy of the Director General, and it's great news that he's gone. I cheer.